have the honor and the pleasure to introduce Professor Zeno Leoni. Zeno Leoni holds a PhD from King's College London with a thesis on Obama's pivot to Asia. He's based at the Department of Defense Studies at King's College London, where he works as a teaching fellow in challenges to international order. Here, he teaches, among other things, a module on rising China for the Higher Command and Staff course. He is also affiliate of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. He's currently working on a book titled American Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush and China's Hegemonic Challenge. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. Before starting the lecture, I would like to provide you with three very short stories. So I live in London, and I attend a lot of networking events in London. And so recently I've met somebody at a networking event. We get along well together. We go to conferences together. She's a Chinese businessman. And all of a sudden, one day at a conference, she asked me whether I was a spy. And she was laughing, she was giggling. And I thought, this is a totally unwarranted question. I couldn't understand why I was asked the question. And she made the same question 2 weeks later when we met again at another conference. And I was thinking about why she would do that. That's the first story. Second story, I was recently giving a similar presentation at All Souls College, which is a very prestigious venue in the Oxford University, and there was a former U.S. intelligence who was listening to my former U.S. intelligence officer who was listening to my presentation, and unfortunately I used the word appeasement, talking about what the U.S. should do with regard to China. We can go through it in the Q&A time at the end of the session. And so this U.S. intelligence officer said that he wouldn't be surprised if I had received £20,000 from the CCP to give that kind of lecture and to say that the U.S. should appease the rise of China. Third story, very briefly. I was telling my student about a connection that I have with an Italian contact in the Chinese government, in one of the local governments of China. He works in the business of IT. And so my students, at some point during our conversation, said, "Do you think he might be a spy?" And so the reason why I'm telling you these three stories is that, first of all, it's because I've never come across the word spy in my career. I don't work in intelligence, and I'm not a spy myself. I'm less interested in those kind of issues. But secondly, these stories made me think quite a lot, and so I have the impression that we are slowly but clearly moving towards some kind of Cold War between the US and China. Certainly this is the kind of mindset, the kind of mood that you see in certain environments and among certain people. In order to understand why we're moving eventually to this kind of Cold War, in my view, we need to start from understanding how US grand strategy works, because if we don't understand that, we cannot understand why China has become such an important issue in international relations. So first of all, if you read the works of scholars writing in US grand strategy studies, they tend to use categories, concepts like hegemony and empire. Hegemony means indirect rule, it means ruled by consensus, and often the scholars who believe that the US has built an hegemony after the end of World War II, they bring as an example the role of the dollar, or the fact that the US has very important, very strategic alliances around the world. If you listen to the scholars who talk about empire, they usually highlight the fact that the US has military bases in strategic regions of the world, but also the fact that the US still controls islands in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, like Guam and the American Samoa. Regardless of where you stand in this debate, my view is that we need to understand that after the end of World War II, the United States managed to promote what they call a global sphere of influence. Global sphere of influence essentially means a form of globalization based on rules, international law, free market rule of law, and so based on rules which were very favorable for the United States, which were at the advantage of the United States, essentially because the United States had and still have probably the most competitive economy in the world, the most advanced. And so it was very convenient for the United States to have this kind of open, globalized order. There is, however, a problem, there is a flaw, there is a limit in this strategy. Although this strategy has been very beneficial for the United States for many decades, this strategy, the global sphere of influence, in order to function, it needs to encourage other states, other countries, to join the world order, to join the global order. And so it needs to encourage other countries to accept the path of competitive capitalism, technological competitions, and so on, free market rule of law, and so on. Unfortunately for the United States, there are some countries, out of all of many countries, there are 3 countries in particular who have learned to imitate the United States really well and who have become really competitive over the decades. And they are challenging the American hegemony. So I'm talking about Japan, Germany, and China. Let's talk very briefly about Japan and Germany before we move on to China. In the 80s, Germany and Japan, from a technological point of view, had become very competitive towards the American economy. So the United States needed to intervene. How? In the 80s, we have the Plaza Accord, where the United States devalued the dollar compared to the yen and the Deutschmark, in order to become, again, more competitive, in order to export more. But also, the Reagan administration imposed some restriction on some quotas on Japan's car export. Because, again, as you know, the Japanese economy is very, very much driven by technological development. It was fairly relatively easy for the United States to do that to 2 countries which, since the end of World War II, had given up any geopolitical, geostrategic aspiration. However, it is much more difficult to control, to make certain kind of impositions on China.